Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Nugget'S News. Today I've got a special guest from the other side of the world, and that is Mark Devlin, who's a radio host, DJ, turned author and researcher. And we're going to be diving into all things occult, symbolism, the nature of reality, and all the juicy research you're doing. So welcome to the show, Mark.
Yeah, what's up, Alex? Good to be with you.
How did you start to go down these rabbit holes, and was there anything you saw in particular firsthand in the music industry, or what led you down this path to truth?
Well, I was a radio and club DJ for many years. That was my full-time job for about 20 years. At that point in my life, it was all I really wanted to do. And my life just consisted of music, tunes, parties, clubs, travel. That's all I was interested in. And it got to about 2007, 2008, when I was starting to ask some big questions in life. Like, what is this place? Who or what created it? What are we doing here? What actually are we? Who are we? We don't know these things. What happens after we supposedly die? And also, who's really running the world? Because it became apparent to me by that point that governments don't run the world. They answer to higher ups. It's secret society networks and groups that stay hidden behind the scenes. I'd got into the work of David Icke. My dad put me onto his books. And prior to that point, I thought the poor man was a nutter and he'd lost his mind. But my dad said to me, no, just give it a chance, read what he has to say. So I did. And I found it was starting to make a lot of sense. It was answering a lot of the questions I'd had up to that point. And I also got put onto the Zeitgeist movie, the first one, by DJ Danny Rampling, actually, very well known British DJ. We were both doing this club gig in Riga, Latvia, and we got stranded there because our flight home was grounded. So we spent an extra 24 hours in Riga before we could get home. And Danny mentioned this movie to me. He said, "Have you heard of Zeitgeist?" I said, "No." He said, "You've got to check it out when you get home." So I did that. And that was a real paradigm shifter for me. And that was it, really. From that point, there was no turning back. I realized that in all good conscience, I couldn't just sit on the knowledge that I was accumulating. And I really had to be putting it out into the world in whatever effective ways I could. So by that point, I'd already put out one book. So I knew how to write. I knew how to do radio shows and interviews. And I thought, well, I just need to be putting all this stuff to use. So I put my first musical truth book out in 2016, and that was based on 5 years worth of research into the true nature of the music industry and how that fits into the bigger picture of what's really going on in this world and who really controls things. And I started doing public talks and loads of videos, thousands of podcasts. And here we are nearly 20 years later, and it's become my life, my full-time job. Never part of the plan, but hey, life is full of surprises, right?
Yeah, exactly. And those Zeitgeist trilogies, if people at home haven't seen those, that was amazing for my journey as well as David Icke stuff, who I'm chatting to in a couple of weeks. So uh,
Oh, cool.
let's talk about manufactured culture. And you mentioned, these intelligence agencies intertwined with secret societies that push out these globalist agenda, and the music industry, and I guess we could extend to Hollywood as well, right? There's a big overlap in how they want to manufacture culture. And I watched a great doco the other day about the depravity, the normalization of just this kind of evil and erasing of morals. And what are your thoughts on all that and how you kind of see the music industry's role in that?
A lot of people are very surprised at the suggestion that popular culture and entertainment can have been weaponized. And even, researchers into truth conspiracy issues who might accept that it's not governments that run the world and the political system is rigged and it's corrupt, and so is the medical system and the financial system and the educational system. When it comes to music, movies, and other forms of popular culture, a lot of people just assume that it's there for their entertainment and fun and just to pass a bit of leisure time. But this is the genius of those vehicles in terms of them being used for mass mind control and pushing of social engineering agendas, because nobody's expecting to have their entire worldviews shaped and molded for them when they think they're just relaxing after a hard day at work and watching a movie or TV show, going to hear a favorite band, listening to a favorite album. It never occurs to them that that could be where the culture creation is going on. And this is how it happens. It's directed at the subconscious mind because the conscious mind is not engaged. You're in relaxation mode. You actually get put into a hypnotic state through TV waves, band waves, frequencies. And you can have all kinds of subliminal programming happening then without your conscious knowledge of it. So it's very important for people to recognize the methods and the tactics that are used through music, movies, and other forms of entertainment to shape and mold their entire worldviews. This is the world of social engineering, which is directed by behavioral scientists and psychologists. These are people that know very well how the human psyche works and therefore how it can be manipulated and shaped and molded in certain desired directions. This is where you get the concepts of culture creation. So entire fads, trends, scenes, movements, which sweep up millions of people in their wake, come out of the world of social engineering. The masterclass study in all of that, as far as I'm concerned, is what was done in the mid to late 1960s with the so-called counterculture, the whole hippie flower power thing. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That was an absolute master study in how all this stuff gets done. And it's been rolled out so many times over the decades, so many different agendas. One that was very personal to me was the acid house rave thing in the UK in the late 1980s. That paved the way for electronic dance music and the explosion in club culture, which then got exported all around the world. And its origins were in that early acid house scene. And it was basically just a reboot of what had been done in America in the 60s. This time it was ecstasy, MDMA, as the drug of choice instead of LSD. It was electronic dance music instead of psychedelic rock. And it was warehouse parties and open-air raves and later superclubs, which were the equivalent of the hippie gatherings and the music festivals of the 1960s. So it's been done many times. You also have the concept of lifetime actors. These are individuals who we think of as one thing or another, a famous actor or a musician or a politician, whatever it may be. And the truth of the matter is that they've been placed into these prominent positions of influence, often by way of the families that they happen to be born into, because family bloodlines, genealogy, ancestry is very important when it comes to comprehending where these manufactured icons and heroes come from. So all of that is one great big melting pot of information and just reasons why all this stuff gets done. And the music industry is just one facet of everything else. It fits into the bigger picture, just like politics does and academia and all the rest of it. And so it's just become my niche area of research. I've just become that guy, I guess, that comments on all this stuff.
How much of the hippie movement do you think was organic? Like a lot of these movements that might start off well-intentioned and then get hijacked by the powers that be. So how much of that do you think was, anti-war and did have good intentions to then get manipulated, and they introduced the pill around the same time as part of all this eugenics with the free love? And so how much of that, what do you think was organic versus the CIA start to come in and manipulate all this with other messages?
It's difficult to say because I wasn't around in those times. I do suspect it would have had some kind of grassroots organic beginnings, and it would have been quickly steered off and hijacked into certain desired directions. So the establishment put its own infiltrators into the scene. You had guys like Dr. Timothy Leary, the consciousness guru, who was pushing the idea of entheogens or psychedelics, hallucinogens. And he was encouraging his students in Harvard University, before he got kicked out of his academic role, to go on these amazing journeys of self-discovery through enhancing their consciousness through all these compounds that were around. Yeah. So there was laboratory produced LSD, which was coming out of the CIA. It's very clear and it's easy to prove that the CIA was the main supply line for all this stuff. Documentation exists to this effect, and even Leary in his latter years admitted to having been an asset of the CIA. So he was helping get to get that whole culture going. And then you had bands like the Grateful Dead, who were pretty much the house band of the sort of early hippie scene. They morphed from a group called the Warlocks. And there are endless connections through the Grateful Dead back to the CIA and to Harvard and Yale and Freemasonry and various expressions of the establishment. Also Bohemian Grove. Bob Weir, one of the key members of Grateful Dead, was an attendee at Bohemian Grove. And then you had people like Gloria Steinem. So she was touted as the mother of modern feminism, and her thing was trying to encourage women to get out into the workplace by selling it as them being just as good as men and their equivalent, and they should be earning just as much as men in these corporate jobs. But the real agenda there was to get women out of their traditional nurturing roles of motherhood and homekeeping into the workplace, so they'd be putting their kids into state-sponsored care, so-called, at ever earlier ages, so that the indoctrination could begin. Meanwhile, all these women going out and earning and doing jobs alongside the men contributed yet more taxation to the government. So it's a winner if you're a psychopathic, satanic elite type, you know? And that's all that was going on in the 60s. So I think it probably started with some kind of honest, genuine intent, but very quickly agents were sent in to make sure that it benefited the system in some way. And then by the end of the 1960s, I think they decided to hammer the final nails in the coffin of that culture, because by the end of 1969, all the idealism of the hippie ethos was pretty much dead. And it just paved the way for the 70s and whatever agendas got pushed then. I think it was probably very similar with the acid house rave scene in the late 80s. There would have been some kind of organic beginnings to that, I guess. But again, there's evidence to show that infiltrators were sent into that scene. And it was, I think, to a large extent, one big social experiment. They just wanted to see what would happen if hundreds of thousands of young people could be coerced into certain behaviors, you know, going out all night, taking drugs, being exposed to all this music with the electronic frequencies, and also the symbolism, you know, the iconography, the sigils. That was a big part of both scenes. You had all this symbolism that was getting absorbed by the subconscious mind. So I think with most of these scenes, there's some element of genuine beginnings, but they always end up going the system's way.
Yeah. Do you want to maybe also touch on, for people at home that aren't familiar, the family aspect that you spoke about, where a lot of these big bands, lead singers and staff have been the children of CIA assets or other bloodline families, and it's sometimes they might even have that much talent. You can kind of get around that with recording technology and whatnot.
Yeah, this is a big aspect of things. There's so many researchers now that are on this path of looking into who the families were of these famous people. There's a couple of guys in the UK known as Sheep Farm Studios, a couple of brothers, Dom and Chris. Are you familiar with them?
No.
Yeah, they do great work. I mean, Don Waterson is an impeccable researcher, and his niche has become plotting the family bloodlines of many of these famous people. He's just put out a book, Traitors, the Plandemic Politicians, where he's looking into where all these government officials that were active during the COVID era, you know, where they came from and how it is that they were elevated to these positions of success over and above all competition. And so often it just comes down to these generational bloodline families that go back many centuries, and new generations of them are ushered into these positions of great influence and prominence. It could be through politics, it could be through movies, TV shows, it could be through music. It doesn't really matter, as long as they're reaching large numbers of people and dictating the way they think about the world. So it's the shaping and molding of people's value systems and perceptions, and just the way they view everything and think about everything. So if the conscious mind is not engaged, it's very easy to fall prey to many of these clever tactics, the weaponization of culture. So you just need to get streetwise as to what gets done so that you can't be fooled in that way. But the generational bloodline family thing is a big issue. And it really does explain why some of these people rise to prominence when they don't really have that much skill or talent. It's quite clear to see.
Yeah.
So that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it's probably more evident in the royal bloodlines and even more so in politics, but probably less accepted in mainstream, the artists in Hollywood and that. But these days we just see, I feel like the club is kind of running out of numbers when you see Justin Trudeau starting to date Katy Perry, and it's just getting more weird and wonderful every day. And a lot of these survivors that you talk to of these bloodlines and satanic ritual abuse talk about these sex parties and the eyes wide shut style parties where rich and powerful people are just getting in there, and who knows who are the true parents of for Princess Diana and all these lookalikes, and people talking about maybe it's a Rothschild, and there's so many examples of this. Justin Trudeau and who's the one that everyone talks about being his father, Fidel Castro, and just all these examples throughout history of these pairings. Yeah.
Well, that's a crazy bloodline. That's one that's worth people looking into if they're new to all of this. So the key to this particular bloodline is Madonna. A lot of people wonder how it was that Madonna became just so successful in the 1980s and has been prominent ever since. She's been pushing many an agenda. She's always finding ways to reinvent herself and try and make herself relevant to new generations. And the reason for that is that she comes from an important long-running bloodline family. And it comes through her French-Canadian mother, Madonna Louise Fortin. So she had the same first two names. And one way or another, professional genealogists have mapped this out. So it's not just some wild fantasy, it can be proven. She is a cousin of Justin Trudeau is one, Justin Bieber coming out of Canada, but also a cousin of Lady Gaga. She's a cousin of Ellen DeGeneres, the chat show host. She's related to Brad Pitt, Tom Hanks, George Bush, Dick Cheney, John Kerry. I mean, this is the crazy thing. George Bush Jr. was a cousin of his own vice president, Dick Cheney. And he was also a cousin of his main opponent in the 2004 American election, John Kerry. So in that year, Americans were being asked to choose between this cousin, who attended Skull and Bones at Yale University, secret society, fraternity, or this cousin who attended Skull and Bones at Yale University. Isn't choice and democracy a wonderful thing? So they're all cousins. Who else is in that bloodline? Princess Diana, you just mentioned, is connected to that lot. Also Camilla, King Charles's wife. They're all bloody cousins. Might be second or third cousins or 12 times removed or whatever, but it's significant that they are cousins. And one thing that a lot of people come back at you with when you present this sort of research is, oh, we're all related to famous people or kings or, statesmen or royalty or whatever, if you go back far enough. But I don't think that's actually true, because I can go back about 3 generations on my mother's side, and I can find nothing but peasants and country folk, turnip pickers. There's no royalty there. So I don't think it's true that we all have these connections, but these famous people do. And that's why they're famous.
Yeah, plenty of convicts in Australians' genealogies most of the time.
Right.
In the music industry, how much first-hand experience have you had, or just stuff you've researched with? I just want to give people that evidence of people that sell their soul or get invited to these rituals. And we have got more of these people now that are speaking out and saying they kind of got invited, or they saw something they didn't like and they stepped away. Obviously, a lot of people get knocked off and whatever, but yeah, where's that side of the research taking you?
I didn't see any direct evidence of any of this stuff when I was more active in the industry. I never really considered myself an integral part of the industry because I was a DJ, I interviewed artists, and I wrote about music in music papers. But I was never really one of the cogs in the machine. So I was kind of skirting around the periphery of the industry, looking in. And I met people like Beyonce, Destiny's Child, when they first started out in 1998. I interviewed them. And I've interviewed quite a number of other famous people, mainly rappers and R&B singers and such. I interviewed Aaliyah, who's passed away in 2001 in a plane crash, and many others. And I didn't really see anything untoward, because at that point I was so wrapped up in all the culture and I was so brainwashed myself. I was just enticed by the music and the tunes and the clubs, and that's all that was important to me. But it's only since I've started doing this research that I've come across the concept of selling your soul for fame and fortune, and a lot of this really dark stuff that goes on in the industry. And that's come to me through insiders. So many, many people, particularly after I put out that first book, Musical Truth Volume 1, in spring 2016, many people have reached out to me and they've said, oh, I've been a singer in the industry or a producer or a record label executive or whatever, and I can confirm that everything you say is true because I've seen it myself. I've seen satanic rituals take place. I've been invited to these P. Diddy, Jeffrey Epstein style Eyes Wide Shut parties where all kinds of crazy stuff goes on. It gets filmed. The footage is used for blackmail to keep these people in line. I've seen politicians. I've seen, all kinds of famous people at these parties. So when I first presented my research in that first book, to start with, I was a bit concerned over whether I'd got it right. Was I making some outrageous claims here that couldn't be backed up? But ever since that first book 10 years ago, I've had nothing but validation from so many people in the industry. Hundreds, if not thousands, of emails from people sharing their own personal stories. It's a very real thing. You don't hear many household names speaking out. And if you think about it, it's pretty obvious that they wouldn't, because there'd be a very high price for them to pay by revealing all this stuff. They might take a bath and never come out of the bathroom, as happens to many artists. So it's understandable why many of these really famous people would just stay quiet about all this stuff. But it's at the lower level where people feel they can speak out more easily and more freely that you get all these revelations. And I've had plenty. So as far as I'm concerned, all this stuff really goes on. And the concept of selling your soul for fame and fortune is one that's absolutely ancient within popular culture. So you have the story of Faust, this German legend of this guy that wanted great worldly knowledge. He had wealth and he'd had an incredibly experienced life, but he just wanted the answers to the bigger questions. And he makes a deal with the devil where he offers up his mortal soul in exchange for this great knowledge and wisdom. And that legend has found itself bleeding into the music industry. It goes a long way back, probably to the classical music era. But in modern popular music, you can trace it back to the 1930s and the legend of Robert Johnson, the blues musician. So there's this myth, this trope that Johnson made a deal with the devil at a crossroads, a remote location. And the crossroads is supposed to symbolize the point where this apparently physical world interacts and intersects with the spiritual world, and it can let entities in through portals. So the idea is that Johnson traded his soul in exchange for great musical proficiency, and he became a very celebrated and accomplished blues guitarist. But it didn't end well for him. He was dead by the age of 27, so he's considered the founder member of the so-called 27 Club. Large number of musicians who turn up dead at the age of 27 in some bizarre circumstance or other. Their number includes Jim Morrison, though I've got my doubts about whether that was a genuine event. That's another matter, but he's said to have died at 27. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, Ron Pigpen McCulloch of the Grateful Dead, Pete Ham of Badfinger, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse, and many, many others. So the idea of selling your soul can be traced back to Robert Johnson, and it just keeps coming at you when you research all this stuff. So many artists have spoken of selling their soul. Freddie Mercury said that. And if you study the lyrics to Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody, you find that that song, one of the most celebrated songs in rock music history, is all about the character, Freddie, who wrote the song, selling his soul. And the middle opera section in that song represents the forces of good and evil, or angels and demons, in the spiritual realm, doing battle over which side is going to get Freddie's soul. That's what Bohemian Rhapsody is all about. And he's just one example of so many artists that have spoken about this. Bob Dylan did that famous interview where he said he's holding up his end of the deal, and he made a bargain a long time ago with the chief commander of this world and the world we can't see. And Ozzy Osbourne spoke about that, and David Bowie spoke about it, and so many other artists. So as far as I'm concerned, it's a very real thing. It could be taken metaphorically. Selling your soul for fame and fortune can mean degrading your morals and just doing whatever is required of you in exchange for engineered fame and fortune. But also it happens, I would suggest, in a literal sense, where a spiritual, metaphysical process takes place where that essence of yourself does get given over to other parties.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of these clips where artists look like they're glitching out, or their eyes change, or they're possessed, and all this type of stuff as well. And if we want to go like a layer deeper into how this extends into other sort of industries and control structures, this is what some of the victims have told me, that they've been at these rituals, they've seen things manifest, and there is an exchange of knowledge and information. This goes deep through history. Is this where they got the idea of usury from in some of these ancient texts? And is this how they kind of roll out the power structures and even this technology, which seems very, very alien when you actually stop and think about all this technology and how advanced it's come in such a relative time frame? Who have we been given this from? So what are your thoughts on all of that?
Well, one area that I've studied a lot these past, getting on for 20 years in total, is the idea of satanic ritual abuse, which often comes with these generational bloodline families. So you get children who are unfortunate enough to be born into the wrong family. And from the very first moment, their future is mapped out for them by other parties, their parents, but also those that control their parents. And they never really stand a chance because that's their destiny from that point on. And they get subjected to satanic ritual abuse, unfortunately, very early in childhood, which causes dissociation from reality. So the mind finds the trauma so difficult to deal with that it causes a kind of firewall and it blocks it off and it causes the mind to shatter into different compartments in order to deal with the trauma. And it's been discovered that each of these compartments, or alters as they're called, can be programmed with a different personality. And these can be called forward by a skilled handler by way of a trigger phrase or color or pattern or whatever it may be, and then tucked away again when it's no longer required. So satanic ritual abuse dovetails very closely into trauma-based mind control of the MK Ultra variety. So MK Ultra was a very far-reaching mind control program cooked up by those nice folks at the CIA. And there's an element of it which is known as monarch programming, which plays out in the entertainment field. So many Hollywood actors and actresses will have been subject to monarch programming, and many singers and famous musicians as well. So when you see these artists undergoing apparent personality changes on stage, I think there's a process going on there. And performers often speak about this. In interviews privately, they can be quite shy and, softly spoken and mild-mannered, but they get up there on stage and a complete shift happens. It's like they're being possessed by some entity. I've been looking at footage of Peter Gabriel from Genesis back in the day. And in many of his performances, he's shaking and contorting and his eyes are glazing over as if something is coming into him.
Yeah.
Michael Stipe of REM exhibits the same sort of thing. And I mentioned Beyonce earlier. She often spoke in interviews a few years ago about this entity called Sasha Fierce that she becomes when she's on stage. And she says, she does all the things that I could never do. I'm never brave enough and bold enough to do that. But when I become Sasha, anything goes. And these artists have these alter egos. Nicki Minaj, the rapper many years ago, had this alter ego called Roman Zelensky.
Yeah.
And she said it was a gay homosexual male that lived inside of her. So it sounds like a frigging demon.
Yeah.
And Lady Gaga had this alter ego called Victor Calderon, which was also a male, she claimed. And there's just too much of this going on for it to be written off as meaningless. There's something happening here. And also, when you think about Hollywood actors, one thing that you often hear said of the very greatest Hollywood actors is, they just get all consumed by their role. It's like they become that person. And you often hear of actors staying in character on set for days or weeks on end. And they don't snap back into their own individual personality. They just stay in the character of whoever they're portraying. And I think there's elements of possession going on there. It's mind control alters, and they're taking over these people. And unfortunately, satanic ritual abuse and all these rituals that go with it are an inherent part of Hollywood and of the music industry. So for anyone looking at these famous actors and singers and thinking, that lifestyle looks great, I'd like to be just like them, I want to be a celebrity when I'm older, you really don't. If you knew more about what goes on when the cameras are turned off, you really would not want these people's lives. Their lives must be hell because they can't make decisions for themselves. They're not free to do all the things that the rest of us are. They can't just make a spontaneous decision to jump in their car and go for a drive or pop down the corner shop because they're going to be mobbed by paparazzi. So you really don't want these people's lives. We're better off with these regular, supposedly mundane lives. And I'm sure many of these celebrities would trade lives with the likes of us in a heartbeat if they could. But they can't.
Yeah, there's that famous interview where Britney Spears switches personalities mid-interview. I'm not sure if you've seen that clip or not. But
sure, yeah.
Another fascinating documentary I watched the other day was about the magician industry. I'll send you a link to it. It was one of the best documentaries I'd ever seen. They were showing all the old magician posters back in the day, how they all acknowledged that they had a devil on their shoulder and they were being possessed, and this was supernatural powers that were working through them to perform these tricks. Yeah, fantastic documentary. I might link that below for people as well. But yeah, let's get into sort of your work about consciousness and the nature of reality. And I know some people sort of say this is a bit black pill and a bit negative, but I think we have to be honest that when we look around the world, most people are struggling to get by. They're consumed just trying to get enough food, water, shelter, which are basic humanitarian needs, right? And then they kind of get to that retirement age and they're normally old and sick if they've been in the matrix and haven't woken up to how to actually be healthy and all the type of stuff we don't get taught. So I think we have to acknowledge that there's very evil system in place to keep people dumbed down, sick, and struggling to get by, while the very, very few have all the resources and money and get to kind of live whatever life they want. So yeah, what are your thoughts about all that and how that fits into just not just our world, kind of like the nature of the whole realm that we find ourselves in?
Well, this is a subject area that I've been tackling since early 2024. And I think when you've been in conspiracy research for long enough, it doesn't matter how you come into it. It might be looking at the music industry, it might be looking at the medical industry, geopolitics, whatever it may be. Eventually, if you're going to go all the way and you're going to allow yourself to be guided by the information, you're going to reach a point of convergence where you have to start looking at the bigger questions. Never mind all the nuts and bolts and mechanics of how the music industry works, important as that detail is, there are more important things, such as questioning what this realm is in the first place. What is the true nature of this reality in which all this stuff can go on? There's some horrible things that happen in the world. What does that say about the nature of this reality that it can happen? And what does it say about the nature of whatever force or entity created it? I think these are questions that need addressing. I certainly don't claim to have all the answers, but I do have all the questions. And so this has been of great interest to me. I started my Mark Devlin God Talks channel on YouTube in January 24, and I've done 25 monologues giving my thoughts and reflections on various things. And it just amazes me that people don't ask these questions, because apparently many people don't. I go out and about, I can be in a pub or a cafe or on a bus or whatever, and I hear people talking. And they're just talking about what they're going to have for dinner tonight, what was on telly, the football, who were playing this weekend, just completely mundane stuff. I never hear conversations out and about where people are questioning the true nature of life and just wondering what we are, what is our essence, what is the nature of our consciousness. How is it possible that you can go through an entire human lifetime without considering these things? And there is something about these times, you mentioned it there. I'm finding the 2020s to be incredibly challenging. I mean, I've got personal stuff going on, but I know everyone has, and pretty much everyone I know is struggling in some way. And I don't know if it's just misty-eyed nostalgia, but I can think back to previous decades when I was growing up, 1970s, 80s, 90s, and I don't remember people struggling as much as they are right now. Or if they were, they certainly didn't talk about it. Sure, we didn't have the internet then, so there wasn't that exchange of information, but life just seemed easier and happier and more fun and less stressful and less dense back in those times. So it certainly feels like there's been some kind of energetic shift in these times, and everything feels like it's sort of coalescing and coming to a head. It's very difficult to put into words, but most people probably know what I'm talking about because they probably feel it themselves. Basically, everyone I know is going through some kind of pain, suffering, hardship in their lives at this point. And primarily, I would consider these people to be good people, in their motives. Most of the people that I know that I count as friends are critically minded truth seekers, and they're doing their best to live without causing harm to others because they can see all the great harm and damage that's already being done in the world, and they don't want to contribute to that further. And what they get in exchange for trying to live according to a moral code, trying to help others, trying to put something positive into the world, all they're reaping is a whole world of shit, pain, suffering, hardship. So it doesn't seem very fair. It doesn't seem very just. And it doesn't seem in keeping with the conventional idea of karma and consequentialism. So those teachings generally espouse that if you live a positive, benevolent life where you're trying to help others and you're trying to do what you know to be right, you will reap consequences in your life which will manifest themselves physically that are in line with your consciousness and your intent. So, in other words, you'll have good things happen to you. Meanwhile, if you're a selfish, psychopathic, murdering Satanist, who tramples over other people's rights and does much worse, eventually karma will catch up with you and bad things will happen to you. But is that the case? If we're honest, if we look around, what do we see? We see all the politicians and all the business leaders and all the controllers of the COVID narrative, for example, from 6 years ago, walking around free men and women. As far as I'm concerned, not one single tyrant and dictator from those times has done a single night of jail time. They've got away with it. And many of them have got incredibly rich. Matt Hancock, for example, who was the so-called health minister here in England, he was on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here in the bloody Australian jungle, being paraded as a celebrity. And then he had a book. He put a book out talking about all the difficult decisions he had to make during those times. So he's got very rich off it. He's got a duper's delight grin plastered all over his stupid, dim face all the time. And he's just walking around free. So is that an example of someone who put great harm into the world, which he quite clearly did, because he was in charge of the so-called Liverpool Pathway health approach in UK care homes, where midazolam and morphine was being routinely administered to old people when they were locked away in these care homes and their relatives couldn't come and visit them. They were basically killing them off.
Yep.
And there's a video of Hancock talking about having ordered in vast quantities of midazolam for this purpose. So just imagine that body count. Just imagine how many people lost loved ones, parents, other relatives in these care homes that weren't allowed to come and see them, weren't with them in their final days. And, the body count from that must be in the hundreds of thousands. And Hancock was directly involved in that. And he's just walking around free. And he's going to remain free for the rest of his days. He'll probably die peacefully in his sleep at a ripe old age. So as far as I'm concerned, karma doesn't work the way we're told it does. If it did, you wouldn't see so many good people suffering, as they quite clearly are. Everything's actually in reverse. It's skewed. It's the opposite of what we're told. If you're good, you're going to reap hardship, unfortunately. And there's quite a few phrases that, speak to this. Only the good die young. No good deed goes unpunished. There's a lot of truth in these maxims. And a lot of people think it's grim and it's black-pilled, as you say. And yes, it's not happy information at all. But I and the other people that comment on this stuff didn't make it this way. It's not our choice. It's not our decision. We don't want to be having to talk about this stuff. I prefer to be doing something happier with my life, but it is what it is. And I'm just commenting on what I'm finding. And a lot of people, it seems, are in alignment with some of the stuff that I've been putting out in my videos, because I get a huge amount of correspondence now from people saying, oh, it's so good to hear somebody else articulating these thoughts and these viewpoints, because I've felt this way for years and it's frustrated the hell out of me. And it's just so good to know that others see it in the same way. So I think there is value to a lot of people in putting out information of this nature, as dark as it can seem on the surface.
Yeah, no, that isolationism is some of the main feedback we get too, and we've made an effort to start meetups and encourage other people to start meetups, because often people will wake up and they'll be the only one in their family or at their workplace and they feel very alone. But once you can connect, that's why we have audiences that are growing in the kind of the real truth movement, because more and more people are waking up. But it is a matter of finding each other. But do you think that part of the reason why we're isolated, I feel, is because of how sophisticated this programming, this matrix that people have been born into in Western societies is. And materialism is low-level Satanism that makes people service to self rather than service to others, and it's just greed, money, power, and then now sex and drugs and all these other addictions. Versus I think most people are born pretty kind people, that if you threw them out in nature, it wouldn't matter what color their skin was or whatever, like people would get along because you have a better chance of survival. So I kind of think that we are inherently good people, but we are definitely, everything in our reality is to program us to become evil, either in the low forms that people don't realize they're being evil, they just think it's normal, all the way through to the actual very evil people at the top.
Yeah, I think David Icke refers to materialism and, that everyday selfishness as Satanism light, because a satanic mindset is one where you're concerned only with your own personal immediate needs, and to hell with everyone else and everything and what the consequences of your actions may be. So I think the controllers, who are dark occultists and Satanists themselves on a very high level, have managed to inculcate that kind of mindset in the general public, so that we've got a sort of dog eat dog, very competitive society where everyone's chasing as much money as they can get just to pay their bills and look after their families and such. And that inevitably leads to a spirit of competition. And the Satanists would love that, because it is a low-level version of their own ideology that has been infused into mainstream society. Yeah, many people feel that talking about the kind of stuff that I now am is very negative. But when you're absorbed into truth and conspiracy culture, you're encouraged to apply the scientific method to everything, which is to question and to see if it's observable, testable, repeatable. And then you also hear about the trivium process of truth discernment, grammar, logic, rhetoric. And these are ancient ways of obtaining large amounts of information, bringing them all together, cross-correlating, see what overlaps and what supports each other, weeding out all the inconsistencies and throwing that out, seeing what you're left with, which would be truth, and then speaking that into the world. And if we apply the questions of the true nature of reality and what force may have created it, to what end and with what motives, if we apply those methods to it, I think if we're going to be honest with ourselves, we would have to conclude that this realm was not created by a loving, benevolent creator that wants the best for us and wants us to thrive and flourish. I would say quite the opposite. And I realize how grim that sounds. And it's totally understandable why so few people want to look at these subjects. So people will build all kinds of firewalls into their consciousness and convince themselves that it's all good. You have these more new agey kind of spiritual teachings, which would suggest that we're here by consent, our souls in some higher level of consciousness agreed to come into this realm and undergo these experiences. And all the pain and hardship and suffering that we undergo is for our own benefit, is to help our souls grow and evolve. And I used to adhere to that. I used to, that way of thinking used to make sense to me, but it no longer does, because I'm just going by what I see left on the table when I've applied those methods of truth discernment.
Yeah.
And so that's just where I'm at this point. And I do intend to write a book on this. So I've written 4 books on the music industry in the Musical Truth series. I've also written 3 allegorical novels. But the next book project I want to do, which I'm going to knuckle down to in 2027, is going to be a book raising all these big questions and just encapsulating it all between the covers of a book.
Yeah, and your God series is great. I think I've watched every episode of that. But when you say the creator of this realm, being evil, and some people can call it the demiurge or Satan or whatever. These are just names that we're trying to name for something that is evil, right? Do you still think that that creator source, that truly all creation comes from, is positive, like we spoke about before, where people are born positive, but it's something about the overlay reality, like this inversion that we find ourselves in of the current system, and that kind of ties into Tartaria or Old World, or were there other periods in history where there was more harmony in nature and everyone had enough and abundance and was happy and healthy?
Well, it's difficult to pinpoint exact points in history where there may have been freedom and abundance and joy, because most accounts of history just give us the opposite, accounts of war and hardship and turmoil and suffering. So there's plenty of that as far back as you want to go. I do personally feel that people are inherently good. Most people, obviously, there are psychopaths and sociopaths and narcissists who would be exceptions to the rule. But for the most part, I think humans are basically good. They would help their fellow man or woman if they could. They don't wish to put harm into the world. It's just that life has been made so difficult that it's almost impossible to avoid doing that. And most people have been mind controlled and brainwashed and hypnotized. So they're not applying critical thought. They're just acting according to instinctive impulses to a very large extent. These are what we would refer to as normies or NPCs, people who have not gone through any kind of conscious awakening process. And they're just allowing themselves to be programmed by mainstream society within its norms and within its parameters. And that's most people in the world. And we all know them. Mm. But I don't think these people are malevolent and of ill intent. There are some researchers out there who say that all the problems in the world stem from humans, people. It's the bad decisions that people make. It's their lack of morality. It's their lack of care. But I would say that it's an unfair playing field, has been from the start. And the reason people don't display the care and the compassion that we would like them to is because of the way they've been programmed and conditioned into this very difficult realm of existence. Life is hard. It's not easy. Yeah. And you reach a certain age, a certain point in life where all that youthful fun and nostalgia begins to fizzle out, and you have to face some harsh truths. That's why most of the talks that I give and most of the conferences that I speak at, I look out into the audience, and for the most part, the audience consists of 50 to 70-year-olds. It's very rare that I find anyone under 40, because people who are younger are, I would imagine, just still enjoying life and still, carving out an existence for themselves. But you reach sort of middle age, and that's where a lot of people start to have these big questions. A lot of people seem to wake up in their 40s or 50s because they realize that life has been pretty much a con job. It's not delivered all the things they thought it would. When they were young, they were full of all these hopes for the future, and they really believed that they could achieve something great in life and get to where they want to be. And you reach sort of halfway through your life and you're like, damn, none of that happened. What's going on? And it just causes you to ask some of these difficult questions. Well, so when I talk about the creator of this realm being malevolent, of evil intent, I'm talking about this entity that we would refer to as the demiurge. People would call it Satan, Yahweh, Jehovah, all these different names, the elder Baoth. But I do personally instinctively lean towards there being a higher, more supreme creative force. And this would be the creative force behind everything. And I like to think that worst case scenario, that force is neutral. It's neither one thing nor the other. And best case scenario is that it's benevolent in intent, and that's where goodness and conscience and care comes from. So I'm not entirely nihilistic in thinking that all hope is lost. I do see this place as a hell realm, but I do think there's something better outside of it. And I do think there's a power much higher than this evil demiurge, from which possibly we emanate. Maybe we're units and expressions of that higher power that have just found ourselves in human form for some reason, in this place for some reason. Yeah. Who knows why? But we're more than just flesh and blood human beings.
Oh, I completely agree with that. Interesting you say about the age of the audience you speak to, because I know particularly now young people are feeling the pinch more than ever, right? They don't have a hope that even with a good job they can't afford. Average house is now $1 million in Australia. They don't have that hope that a lot of the younger people had. They can't afford to go out and have the fun nights drinking or that, back in the day, the ecstasy or the raves and those other fun times we got to enjoy. It seems like there's less and less enjoyment and more addiction for them now more than ever. And one of the ways to break free of all this, as you say, is talking about the dark stuff, because I truly believe knowledge is power. They say it's easier to convince someone. You can't convince someone they've been fooled, or whatever that saying is. You know what I'm getting at there. Have you got off the top of your head?
It's easier to fool someone than to convince them that they've been fooled, or
That's
words
it.
to that
Sorry,
effect.
mate. It's been a long day here. Thanks for that. But yeah, knowledge is power, and until people start to question, well, where are my thoughts coming from? Why do I believe that? Is it just because I've been programmed through movies and media and propaganda in school, or do I actually have any evidence of this being real in the real world? But I guess just to wrap up, one thing that I've been really exploring with guests and my own thought experiments. What are your thoughts on the kind of idea of this other natures of reality around us, the astral realm, the spirit realm, whatever people want to call it, where these entities are parasiting off our energy? So we've got the examples of people talking about loosh, all the way through to physical manifestations of this, adrenochrome and this really dark stuff we hear about. But I had someone explain this to me the other day, that through all this social engineering, and now that you've normalized porn, OnlyFans, you've got addiction, everyone's got the sports betting app. So all these things that are greed, dopamine, more kind of Satanism light, like we spoke about before, then maybe this is why the realm is getting more evil or harder for everyone, because people just don't have control. They're not doing this by free will, right? Nobody wants to be an addict or gamble all their money away or have porn addictions and this type of thing. And so are these entities, when people talk about the devil on your shoulder and that angel on your shoulder, and they have that little voice in their head. So what are your thoughts on all that with these energetic, parasitic type arguments that people make?
Well, first of all, you mentioned that young people in these times probably don't have the amount of fun that the likes of us did back in the day. I'm of the generation known as Generation X, which is roughly born 1965 to about 1982. And I personally feel that we're a very privileged generation, because we're the last generation that has living memory of when times were slightly saner, slightly less intense, and a lot more fun. I lived through the 80s and the 90s, and I had an absolute blast. I loved everything about those decades. Of course, I didn't know any of this information that I know now, so I was blissfully ignorant and oblivious, but I had fun. And I wonder how easy it is for young people now, Gen Z and Gen Y and Gen Alpha, to have the kind of fun that we did back in the day, because a lot of those opportunities have been taken away from them. Technology now rules everything, digital, electronic ways of doing things. We're the last generation that remembers more organic, analog ways of doing things. So we weren't entirely dependent on tech and addicted to phones and stuff like that. And I wonder if any future generation now is ever going to be able to live like that, because tech has just become such an important part of our lives. You can't really function without it. So I think a lot of people in these times would undergo an entire human lifetime without having one original thought that comes from their own consciousness that's not been placed there, largely through popular culture and entertainment, but also through societal programming. So most people are just going through the motions. They're basically automatons. This is the NPC normie idea, and until somebody undergoes a so-called conscious awakening and starts questioning things and starts doing research, that's going to be their existence, and that's no kind of meaningful life at all. In terms of could there be other realms beyond this physical one, it's certainly a subject area I've looked into. Going into the Gnostic creation myth, the idea there is that this demiurge character, which they called Yaldabaoth, created this physical realm and trapped these units of infinite consciousness, the divine source, divine sparks, in physical form in this world. And that's what we are, and that's why things are so difficult here. And beyond this physical 3D world, you have what's referred to as the astral realm. And this is also controlled by these archons, these entities that are doing the bidding of this demiurge entity. And the idea is that when you die, you end up in the astral realm and you undergo these entities, these beings that are going to try and trick and coerce you into coming back in through the reincarnation soul trap. So it's an idea that I've considered. I'm not entirely nailing my colors to that mast, but I'm not throwing it out either. And this is the insanity of these lives to me, because we just find ourselves here. We reach a point in early childhood, maybe 3 or 4 years of age, where we become vaguely conscious of the fact that we exist. And we can look at ourselves in the mirror and we see that that's us. and we're just left to make our own way through the world. If you're born into a religious family or a religious community, you're going to have that dogma put on you, and you're going to be told this is the way that you interpret life, and this is the way you interpret God, and this is your place within the system of things. And that will depend on which part of the world you just happen to be born into. So if you're born in the Middle East, you're probably almost certainly going to be raised a Muslim. If you're born in the Western world, you may well probably will be raised a Christian, if anything at all. But the madness of it is that each of these religious institutions, and even spiritual traditions like New Age teachings, will tell you that they've got all the answers. All you got to do is read this book and study these texts and adhere to this code of behavior. And that's where you'll find all the answers. Meanwhile, the next religious minister will come along with his holy book and say, no, 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 they're heathens. They've got it all wrong. Don't listen to them. I've got all the answers. And then somebody else will come along and contradict what he's got to say. So how the hell, excuse the pun, are you supposed to determine which is the correct one? There was even an episode of The Simpsons, I seem to recall, where Homer is questioning when he goes to church every Sunday. He's just conditioned to do it, doesn't really think about it. He wonders if he's praying to the right God. And he's like, what if I've got it wrong? And what if, God is something different? So, yes, this is the madness. This is the dilemma that we all face. We're just left to navigate our way through this confusing and challenging realm, this experience we call life. We've got no guidebook, no manual. We don't know where we've come from, who we are, or where we're going. And we're just left to make the best of it. So we can have our best guesses, and we can speculate, and we can have our instinctive ideas of how things are. But ultimately, the truth is nobody really knows. And whenever I encounter someone that says, I know exactly what this realm is all about, I know exactly the nature of God and the nature of us, I'm very suspicious of them, because how can you know? How can anyone know? Yeah. We're just left with a great big question mark over everything. But isn't it more important to at least consider these questions while we've got the opportunity in these lives with the consciousness with which we've been blessed to at least consider these questions? What a waste of these resources to go through an entire human lifetime without even thinking about these things. And then one day you die, who knows what lies beyond. But if you've not done any kind of reflecting or musing on the possibilities of what may lie beyond, I don't know what the consequences might be for your soul.
Yeah. Well, thankfully, I see more and more people, saying no to these systems and wanting to have deep chats, and it's really accelerated since COVID. And even like we spoke about in the pre-interview, a lot of these topics that you couldn't mention on certain platforms, a lot of bigger and bigger channels are at least starting to approach these. But that's been brilliant, Mark. I'll put all the links to follow you down below. But any final thoughts for people at home?
Well, not really, other than just bear in mind that there are a lot of people that are aligned with the sort of stuff that we've spoken about today. And it can feel isolated and lonely, as you mentioned. One thing that I found during the COVID years was I was getting so many emails from people saying, oh, I feel so alone. I feel so cut off. There's nobody in my community talking about the things that I want to talk about. Friends and family have ostracized me. I've got no one to associate with. And they'll be in, I don't know, Liverpool or something. Then I'll get an email from somebody in Southampton. And they'll say, oh, I feel so alone. I've got nobody to talk to. Then I'll get an email from somebody in Australia saying the same thing, somebody in Germany saying the same thing. And you realize there are way more people out there than you would ever think who are seeing the world in the same way as you and going through the same challenges and asking the same questions. If there was any kind of benefit to the COVID dystopia, it was the fact that people came together. In London, there were these huge marches in 2021, which I felt very privileged to be a part of. And at the biggest one, there was well in excess of 1 million people. It was 1 million people who were all pissed off with all their freedoms being taken away in life and all this overreach into every aspect of their lives. And they just had enough, and they wanted to take to the streets and give a visual message that they weren't having it anymore. And there was so much camaraderie and so much fellowship among people at those events. And sadly, that all fizzled out. The COVID restrictions went away, and everyone got back to normal life, and they stopped meeting up in that way. But it was at least a reminder of how strong we can be when we come together and we're united on the same page. So I guess a parting message to people would be just to remember that if you feel alone and you feel very sort of isolated in the way you're seeing the world, there are going to be many, many other people out there that feel the same way. And we just have to find ways of getting together. I mean, with my God Talks videos, I'm getting some great comments now. People are leaving comments on the YouTube or on the Odyssey and Rumble versions. And I'm getting conversations going between different people, and they're realizing that others are seeing things the same way they do. And that's what the value is, I think, in putting this information out. A lot of people will say it's negative and these are horrible things to have to think about. Yeah, they're not the happiest. But if it's a way of bringing people together and bringing a form of therapy and, you know, a cathartic process, then that's something that's beneficial. It's worth doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd encourage people to sort of speak up and share stuff if you're into this on your socials, because you never know if someone else in your workplace or another friend is there waking up, and it's often the people you'll least expect that I'll get messages from. I thought you were crazy 5 years ago, but I've woken up now, and that type of thing. And it's kind of my hope that if we do go down this fewer lockdowns path, that it will be like COVID, as you say, but maybe it won't fizzle out this time. Maybe we'll have another big mass awakening of people if we do get the fuel lockdowns.
There was the stand in the park thing. I think that originated in Australia, didn't it? And then it was brought over to England, and they were great as well, those stand in the park meetups, but they fizzled out. I mean, I guess they fizzled out in Australia as well.
Yeah, cool. All right, Mark, I really appreciate that. Hope you guys at home have enjoyed that. Give Mark's work a follow, and we'll have to have you back on in future, mate. Cheers.
Cheers. Appreciate that. All the best.